Based on the Project 2025 Presidential Transition Project document, implementing this model would lead to significant changes across multiple sectors in the United States. Here's an overview of how the country might look. 1. Family and cultural life. Restoring the family. Emphasis on making the family the centerpiece of American life. Policies would likely focus on protecting children from what is perceived as harmful cultural influences and promoting traditional family values. Education reform. Shift away from woke public schools with increased support for alternatives like trade schools, apprenticeship programs, and other educational opportunities that align with conservative values. 2. Government and administration. Dismantling the administrative state. Efforts to reduce the size and scope of the federal bureaucracy, returning more governance to local and state levels. 22-3 source. Executive reorganization. Significant changes in how the executive office and various federal departments operate, aiming to implement conservative policies and reduce what is seen as overreach by federal agencies. 3. Economic policies. Pro-growth economic reforms focus on economic freedom, supporting small businesses, and reducing the influence of what is described as crony capitalism. Policies would aim to create a more competitive and less politically influenced market environment. Source. First Amendment rights, ensuring freedom of speech, particularly in educational and public institutions, while protecting conservative voices from censorship. 22. Source. 4. National sovereignty and security, defending sovereignty, strong measures to protect national borders and national interests against foreign threats, with a particular focus on countering the influence of China and other global adversaries. 1-2-3 source. 5. Individual liberties, securing individual rights, policies designed to protect what are viewed as God-given rights, emphasizing personal freedom and reducing government interference in daily life. 2-3 source. 6. Political landscape, conservative unity, efforts to unify the conservative movement around a common set of policies and principles, addressing internal divisions within the movement, and presenting a cohesive front in national politics. 22-3 source. Overall, the implementation of the Project 2025 model would result in a shift towards conservative governance, focusing on traditional family values, economic freedom, national sovereignty, and a reduction in federal government size and influence. To determine whether Project 2025 goes against the Constitution, we need to evaluate specific elements of the project against the principles and provisions outlined in the Constitution. Here are a few key considerations based on the Constitution. 1. Checks and balances. The Constitution establishes a system of checks and balances among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches to prevent any one branch from gaining too much power. 34 source. If Project 2025 concentrates excessive power in the executive branch or undermines the authority of Congress or the judiciary, it could be seen as violating this principle. 2. Separation of powers. The Constitution clearly delineates the powers and responsibilities of each branch of government. 34 source. Any initiative that blurs these lines or encroaches on the powers of another branch would be constitutionally problematic. 3. Individual rights and freedoms. The Bill of Rights and subsequent amendments guarantee various individual freedoms, including freedom of speech, religion, and the press, the right to due process, and protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. 34 source. Policies within Project 2025 that infringe upon these rights could be considered unconstitutional. 4. Due process and equal protection. The 5th and 14th Amendments guarantee due process and equal protection under the law. Source. Any actions or policies that deny these protections to certain groups or individuals would violate the Constitution. Given the outlined goals and strategies of Project 2025, several potential constitutional conflicts could arise, such as centralization of power. If Project 2025 aims to centralize power in the executive branch, it could disrupt the balance of power intended by the Constitution. Restrictions on freedoms. Any measures that restrict freedom of speech, press, or assembly would directly conflict with First Amendment rights. Discrimination. Policies that discriminate against certain groups or individuals would violate the Equal Protection Clause. It is important to note that the specifics of Project 2025 would need to be evaluated in detail to determine potential constitutional violations. If there are concerns about its constitutionality, these would likely need to be addressed through legal challenges and judicial review. If the Supreme Court were to rule that the president has full immunity, the implications for Project 2025 could be profound and far-reaching. Here's an analysis of how this could potentially affect the implementation and impact of Project 2025. The PASHER, centralization of power, unchecked executive authority. Full immunity for the president would likely lead to a significant centralization of power within the executive branch. This would enable the president to implement policies and actions without fear of legal repercussions, which could streamline the implementation of Project 2025's objectives. Weakening of checks and balances. The principle of checks and balances, fundamental to the Constitution, could be severely weakened. The legislative and judicial branches would have limited ability to hold the president accountable for actions that might overstep constitutional bounds. Implementation of Project 25 except a policy implementation. With full immunity, the president could push forward the Project 2025 agenda more aggressively and without concern for legal challenges. This could lead to rapid changes in federal policies, regulations, and enforcement. Potential overreach. There would be a risk of executive overreach, where actions taken in the name of Project 2025 could infringe upon states' rights and individual liberties without any recourse for legal challenge. Impact on freedoms and rights. Civil liberties. Full immunity could embolden actions that restrict civil liberties. Measures that might previously have been checked by the judiciary could proceed unchecked, potentially leading to violations of free speech, freedom of assembly, and other fundamental rights. Political dissent. Those who oppose Project 2025 could find themselves with limited avenues to challenge the administration's policies. This could lead to an environment where political dissent is suppressed, either directly through executive actions or indirectly through a chilling effect on free expression. Constitutional implications. Erosion of the rule of law. The concept of the rule of law, where no one is above the law, is a cornerstone of American democracy. Full immunity for the president would undermine this principle, creating a situation where the president operates outside the constraints that apply to other government officials. Potential for abuse of power. With full immunity, there would be a heightened risk of abuse of power. The president could potentially engage in actions that serve personal or political interests, rather than the public good, without fear of legal consequences. Societal and political consequences. Public trust in the government and its institutions could erode if the perception is that the president is above the law. This could lead to increased political polarization and civil unrest. Democratic norms. The norms of democratic governance, including accountability, transparency, and the separation of powers, could be fundamentally altered. This could have long-term implications for the functioning of American democracy. If the Supreme Court were to grant the president full immunity, it would likely lead to a significant shift in the balance of power within the federal government, enabling the rapid and potentially unchecked implementation of Project 2025. This could pose serious risks to civil liberties, the rule of law, and democratic norms, fundamentally altering the landscape of American governance. Granting the president full immunity could lead to a significant risk of losing various freedoms. Here's a breakdown of how different aspects of freedom might be affected. Civil liberties and personal freedoms. 1. Freedom of speech and expression. Potential for censorship. With unchecked power, the president could implement policies that restrict free speech, especially criticism of the government. Suppression of dissent. Dissenting voices, including journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens, might face increased scrutiny and punishment. 2. Freedom of assembly and protest. Crackdown on protests. The government could more easily suppress public demonstrations and protests, using executive power to limit gatherings that oppose its policies. Increased surveillance. There could be increased surveillance and monitoring of groups and individuals perceived as threats. 3. Freedom of religion. Forced religious conformity. Policies could be enacted that favor certain religious beliefs over others, potentially marginalizing minority religions and those who are non-religious. Restrictions on religious practices. There could be restrictions on how and where people can practice their religion if it conflicts with government policies. Legal and constitutional protections. 1. Due process. Erosion of legal protections. Individuals might lose protections under the law, facing detention or punishment without fair trials or due process. Arbitrary detention. There could be increased instances of people being detained without clear charges or legal justification. 2. Right to privacy. Increased government surveillance. The government could expand surveillance programs, infringing on privacy rights. Data collection. More intrusive data collection and monitoring of personal communications and activities might occur. Political freedoms. 1. Electoral integrity. Manipulation of elections. Full immunity could allow for the manipulation of electoral processes to maintain power. Suppression of opposition. Political opponents might face legal or extra-legal measures to reduce their influence and ability to challenge the government. 2. Freedom of the press. Control over media. The government could exert more control over the media, limiting independent journalism and the free flow of information. Targeting journalists. Journalists and media outlets critical of the government might face harassment, legal challenges, or other forms of suppression. Social and economic freedoms. 1. Economic freedom. Regulation of businesses. Policies might be enacted that favor certain businesses or industries aligned with government interests, stifling competition and innovation. Worker rights. Labor protections could be weakened, affecting workers' rights to fair wages, safe working conditions, and collective bargaining. 2. Social policies. Restrictions on social programs. Programs that support social welfare, health care, and education might be altered or defunded to fit specific ideological goals. Discrimination. Policies might disproportionately affect marginalized communities, leading to increased social inequality. Impact on democratic norms. 1. Checks and balances. Weakening of institutions. The balance of power between branches of government could be undermined, weakening the role of Congress and the judiciary in checking executive actions. Centralization of power. The president could gain unprecedented control over government functions, reducing the effectiveness of democratic oversight. 2. Public trust. Erosion of trust. Public trust in government institutions and the rule of law could diminish, leading to increased cynicism and disengagement from the democratic process. Potential for civil unrest. Discontent with the loss of freedoms and increased government control could lead to social unrest and conflict. In summary, granting the president full immunity poses a significant threat to various freedoms and could fundamentally alter the nature of American democracy. The potential for abuse of power, erosion of legal protections, and suppression of dissent could lead to a loss of civil liberties, political freedoms, and social justice, making it critical to uphold checks and balances within the government. Combining the principles outlined in Project 2025 with presidential immunity could indeed create conditions that resemble a dictatorship. Here's an analysis of how these factors might contribute to such an outcome. Centralization of power. Unchecked authority. With full immunity, the president could act without fear of legal repercussions, effectively removing the checks and balances essential to a democratic system. Executive overreach. Policies from Project 2025 that aim to consolidate power within the executive branch could further diminish the roles of Congress and the judiciary, concentrating power in the hands of the president. Suppression of opposition. Targeting political opponents. The president could use immunity to target political opponents, suppress dissent, and silence critics without consequence. Control over law enforcement. With increased control over federal agencies, the president could direct law enforcement to act against perceived enemies, including opposition leaders and activists. Manipulation of democratic processes. Elections. Full immunity could allow for manipulation of electoral processes, ensuring the president and their allies remain in power. Legislative manipulation. The president could bypass Congress on critical issues, undermining the legislative process and imposing policies unilaterally. Impact on civil liberties. Censorship. Freedom of speech and press could be severely restricted, with media outlets and individuals facing repercussions for criticizing the government. Surveillance. Increased surveillance and monitoring could be used to control the population and suppress dissent. Erosion of institutional checks. Judiciary. Judicial independence could be compromised, with judges facing pressure or removal if they oppose presidential policies. Congress. Legislative powers could be weakened, with Congress struggling to check the president's actions or pass legislation without executive approval. Economic and social control. Economic policies. The president could implement economic policies that favor certain groups or corporations, leading to increased inequality and potential exploitation. Social policies. Social programs could be altered or defunded to align with specific ideological goals affecting healthcare, education, and welfare systems. Potential for abuse of power. Arbitrary decisions. With full immunity, the president could make arbitrary decisions without accountability, leading to potential abuses of power. Human rights violations. Policies could lead to human rights violations, including detention without trial, torture, or other forms of repression. Public reaction and civil unrest of trust. Public trust in government institutions could erode, leading to increased cynicism and disengagement from the democratic process. Civil unrest, discontent with the loss of freedoms, and increased government control could lead to social unrest and conflict. Have a conclusion. The combination of Project 2025 and presidential immunity has the potential to undermine democratic principles and establish a dictatorial regime. This scenario would likely lead to the centralization of power, suppression of opposition, manipulation of democratic processes, erosion of civil liberties, and potential abuses of power, all hallmarks of a dictatorship. If Project 2025 and presidential immunity were implemented simultaneously, the country could undergo significant changes that may resemble a more autocratic or dictatorial system. Here's a detailed conclusion of how the country might look. Centralization of power. 1. Executive dominance. The president would wield unprecedented power with little to no checks from other branches of government. Decision-making processes would become heavily centralized within the executive branch. 2. Erosion of checks and balances. Traditional checks and balances provided by Congress and the judiciary would be significantly weakened. The president could effectively bypass these institutions, reducing their ability to provide oversight or counterbalance executive actions. Suppression of dissent. 1. Political oppression. Political opponents and dissenters could face increased surveillance, harassment, and legal action. The use of federal agencies to target and silence critics would likely become more common. 2. Media control. Freedom of the press would be curtailed, with media outlets facing censorship, intimidation, or shutdown if they publish content critical of the government. Manipulation of democratic processes. 1. Electoral integrity. Elections might be manipulated to ensure the continued dominance of the president and their allies. This could include gerrymandering, voter suppression, and interference with the electoral process. 2. Legislative manipulation. The legislative process would be undermined as the president could push through policies unilaterally, bypassing the need for congressional approval on critical issues. Impact on civil liberties. 1. Censorship and surveillance. There would be increased censorship of public discourse and extensive surveillance of citizens, infringing on privacy and freedom of expression. 2. Repression of rights. Civil liberties, including the right to protest and freedom of assembly, would be heavily restricted. People could face imprisonment or other penalties for participating in anti-government activities. Institutional changes. 1. Judicial independence. The judiciary would likely lose its independence, with judges facing pressure to align with the president's agenda or risk removal. Number 2. Congressional power. Congress would struggle to exercise its legislative power effectively, becoming a largely symbolic institution with limited influence over national policy. Economic and social control. 1. Economic policies. Economic policies would favor those aligned with the president, leading to increased inequality and potential cronyism. Economic control could be used as a tool to reward loyalty and punish dissent. 2. Social programs. Social programs could be redesigned to reflect the administration's ideological goals, potentially undermining public services like healthcare, education, and welfare. Human rights and rule of law. 1. Human rights violations. The rule of law would be compromised, leading to potential human rights violations, including arbitrary detention, lack of fair trials, and even torture. Number 2. Arbitrary governance. Governance would become more arbitrary, with decisions driven by the president's interests rather than the rule of law or democratic principles. Public reaction and stability. 1. Loss of trust. Public trust in government institutions would decline sharply, leading to widespread disillusionment with the political system. 2. Civil unrest. Increased repression and loss of freedoms could provoke significant civil unrest, protests, and potentially violent conflicts as citizens resist authoritarian measures. Conclusion. In essence, the country under the combined influence of Project 2025 and presidential immunity would likely move towards a more authoritarian regime. The concentration of power in the executive branch, suppression of dissent, erosion of democratic processes, and significant curtailing of civil liberties would characterize this shift. The overall impact would be a dramatic transformation of the nation's political and social landscape, resulting in diminished freedoms and increased government control over all aspects of life.